Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I'm Denise Malco. I'm a professor joint between the Center for Policy Research for Energy and Environment in SPIA and the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. I'm really delighted today to have the honor of introducing my former boss from the Environmental Protection Agency, Dr. Andersen, who I've known for now, I think, over 35 years. I met him shortly after college while I was working for an environmental consulting firm in Washington, D.C. And he was just starting as a PhD economist at the EPA with a PhD from UC Berkeley and a decade of work at non-governmental organizations. He started in the Global Change Division and was responsible there for implementing the Montreal Protocol, which is, as you all know, the treaty to protect stratospheric ozone. While at EPA from 1986 to 2009, he became director of the Stratospheric Ozone Protection Division and co-chaired the International Montreal Protocol Technology and Economic Assessment Panel. He was my boss for the 2 years I spent at EPA from 1988 to 1990. And during my time working with him, I was often absolutely astonished at how effective he was at working with industry and motivating them to make changes to production processes to reduce and ultimately eliminate the use of ozone-depleting compounds in their processes. Just as an example of one of the things that amazed me was that he had a small office filled with bookshelves. The bookshelves were filled with binders. The binders were filled with business cards organized by country, by corporation, and by rank. And he knew everybody in those, and he was able to pick up the phone and call people up and ask them to do things, which was totally amazing to me because I had been working on the electronics industry, figuring out how to get rid of CFC use in removing flux from printed circuit boards. And we had put together a consortium of industry and military and EPA and NGOs to figure out how to do that. We designed collectively a printed circuit board which captured all of the functionalities the military required and needed to be cleaned by different processes to determine what would work. And we were trying to test things before sending them to this military lab for sort of the final approval. And Steve just picked up the phone and said, we really need to get this testing done. He called Steve Shiddick, who was then vice president for environment at AT&T, and said, can we run this test through your lines on Friday? I was like, what? He said, I'm sorry, the lines are full on Friday, but would Monday be okay? And then off to the races it went. I think this type of example went on all the time. And so he was extraordinary at creating highly effective industry-government partnerships that included chemical producers, that included ozone-depleting substance end users, as well as EPA, military, environmental NGO members that work together to identify substitutes for these ozone-depleting substances. He also created ozone and climate protection awards that motivated industry to go beyond what was immediately required by regulations. And as a PhD economist, he was really unusual in his eagerness to work with scientists and engineers. And he ultimately has co-authored a number of prestigious peer-reviewed papers with them, and he's published a series of books on the process in the Montreal Protocol. I think his largest contribution was an extraordinarily effective international leader, responsible in large part for the identification of alternatives and substitutes for CFCs, and ultimately for the success of the Montreal Protocol, which I really believe is the single most effective international treaty the world has ever agreed to, and has been enormously impactful both in protecting stratospheric ozone and in addressing climate change, because these molecules, these ozone-depleting substances, are extremely strong greenhouse gases. And I think as people shared today, reducing their emissions was probably the single most, or maybe unequivocally the single most effective thing the world has done to reduce climate change so far. Since retiring, EPA has been the director of research for the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development in Washington, D.C. And he's continued his work on ozone and climate, just returning 2 weeks ago from the most recent conference of the parties, the Montreal Protocol in Bangkok, where he heard one of my former PhD students speaking on some work that we started here at Princeton, looking at nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas that also is a very strong ozone depleter, and which we argued then, and Dave Cantor is still arguing today, should be included in the Montreal Protocol. So today we have the opportunity to learn from him some of the secrets to his effectiveness in working at EPA with both Republican and Democratic administrations and around the world to mobilize industry support for a transition away from chemicals that are both ozone-depleting agents and greenhouse gases, and then towards alternatives that protect both stratospheric ozone and climate.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. My ambition today is to tell you a story that will motivate you to take the lessons from the Montreal Protocol and then apply those to your own strategy for whatever you're doing to protect Earth. This is a summary of the presentation. I've organized this, as you can tell by the last slide on this deck, that it's got a brief presentation and then backup slides by topic. So I would urge you to get a set of these slides and then study them so you can recall what I've said, and there'll be an elaboration, and then there's paths you can take through the literature to follow that up. The most important aspects are what I've listed here, that it was not easy. If you listen to people about the Montreal Protocol, some literature says if it was accomplished, it must have been easy. It's a very cynical view of policy. And then they will have the corollary, which is the reason that climate's not accomplished is it's hard. And so watch for that through my slides. It did happen, and it was a success, and it's the case that you can repeat this. This wasn't a magical one-off. It didn't have a lot of advantages over any other issue of environmental protection, and I think that these lessons really are useful. And of course, I would urge people that are at a great university to use every opportunity to learn what you need to do and practice what you need to do in order to be successful at your ambitions. Almost everybody wants to make a difference in the world. It's worthwhile taking that seriously, especially when you're a student and the world's counting on you. You'll find that there's a gold mine of literature available from the Montreal Protocol, that from the start we knew that was extraordinary, and so we started documenting. We kept documenting it. In fact, there's a huge archive at Harvard University, original documents, including negotiating materials from non-government organizations and governments and from the meetings and from the various authorities along the way. So we'll go from there. These are the publications that I co-authored over the last 35 or 40 years. And about every 10 years and sometimes every 5 years, we would pause and get a group of experts together. And you can see in red here that the most extraordinary aspect, I think, of all these publications is that there is a collection of essays in each book by the people that made things happen, telling how they did it. So they're bearing witness to the magic that they implemented, some of which Denise mentioned. This witness is important because it gives an added element to what would ordinarily be just a traditional history. You probably all know that chlorofluorocarbons were invented in about 1929. They were to replace ice in refrigerators, but also to replace toxic and flammable refrigerants that were being used in mechanical systems. The reason the ice needed to be replaced in the United States, which was the supplier for the world, if you look at a map of where ice from North America went, especially the Eastern Shore, it went to India, it went to Africa, it went everywhere. Cheaper to ship ice from the United States than to get it from the Himalaya if you're trying to bring it down into the flatlands of India. It was polluted in the United States. That's why it became an unaccepted use in refrigeration. It's terrific refrigerant. It was drinking water as well as refrigeration, and while it was pure, it was worthwhile. But human settlements and logging and mining and all kinds of manufacture made it impossible to market this product safely. Kind of tragic. So the chlorofluorocarbons were unintentionally offered as an alternative to flammable and toxic refrigerants, and at the time they looked good. It was an unintended consequence that they destroy the ozone layer and they force climate. Other than that, colorless, odorless, low toxicity, low flammability, energy efficient, and very inexpensive to produce. So the recap of the ozone story is that the ozone layer shields the Earth from the harmful effects of ultraviolet radiation from the sun. If you deplete the ozone, it increases the ultraviolet light, and that causes skin cancer and cataracts. It suppresses the human immune system. It damages agricultural and natural ecosystems. It diminishes aquatic and terrestrial carbon sinks, which is important for climate, of course, and it deteriorates the built environment, including stone, wind, paint, wood, paint, and other materials. So it makes the things that you have as assets last longer. Big impacts. In 1974, Mario Molina, who was a postdoc at University of California, Irvine, working with Professor Frank Sherwood Rowland, warned that CFCs deplete stratospheric ozone in a seminal paper. It was alarming. The next year, Ramanathan at San Diego showed that the CFCs were greenhouse gases. So it's been a long time from these early warnings until today, an incredibly long time. The Montreal Protocol that was signed in 1987 has phased out the production and consumption of 99% of about 100 ozone-depleting substances. Not all the ozone-depleting substances, some are left, as you may know, but it's an extraordinary effort. And because these are also greenhouse gases, it protected the climate. I'm going to show you the estimates of that, quite amazing. So the first lesson is a lesson that we all might have to relive a little bit too vividly, is that it was a brutal fight for the first 10 years and episodically afterward. That Mario Molina was accused accurately of being from Mexico. Sherry Rowland was accused accurately from being from California, but they were also claiming that they were communist enemies of humans and that they would diminish the quality of life and prosperity. So it was as bad an attack as you would see on other environmentalists at the time. So this was a heroic measure for these people to stay the coast. They also said that it was just a theory. There was no observed ozone depletion. Why get concerned over a hypothesis? Plenty of time, nothing to worry about, and made the case that the real experts were in the chemical companies themselves, and they should be the people you would listen to. Trust the chemical companies. And it included their advertising, including DuPont's slogan, better living through chemistry. And they promoted the uses of even the applications that Mario and Sherry urged for boycotts successfully, which were aerosol propellants for hairspray, deodorants, and household pesticides that probably never should have been used because these were dangerous pesticides sprayed inside homes, in nurseries and kitchens and all kinds of places. So if you went back and looked at those products, you would say that's a huge side benefit of what was done. So then in about 1984 and 85, industry agreed that there was mounting evidence that there had been no hypothesis produced about where else these CFCs could be going and what was their atmospheric fate. And so they said, we need an agreement. But they said, you can't just do this nationally, which is where it was being done. You have to make an international agreement. And someone that was skeptical like me would say that that made it harder. The idea of the United States EPA regulating something and persuading other countries, what I would call the prime producers and consumers, is a little bit easier than getting 198 countries to all agree to an international treaty at the same time. And all the terms are just agreed by consensus, right? So then, in 1985, you might remember there was a discovery by the British Antarctic Service that there was an Antarctic ozone hole. Every winter in the Arctic calendar over the Antarctic and extending as far as Argentina in some years. So this was shocking to the public. It was also shocking to the people that were using CFCs because they had been assured by the chemical companies there was nothing to worry about. So the public, the policymakers, and the companies depending on the chemicals were appalled by this. And then there was an emergency activity that, of course, found the smoking gun that, in fact, it was CFCs and other ozone-depleting substances. So this is the image that NASA created to communicate the ozone hole. You can see the reach that it has there across Argentina and so forth, and across all of the Antarctic. And some people would argue that this was an advantage of the Montreal Protocol, that is so vivid that surely the public would act. And they did. So it's true that this was a very effective science communication. This simple idea that something large, unimaginable, unpredicted had already happened and had been going on for at least 5 or 6 years. That this data was not 1 year of data, it was the time series of data, and the scientists had withheld the alarm because they thought they'd miscalibrated their instruments. They thought if they noticed it and no other station reported it, surely it was their mistake, and they thought the NASA scientists would be watching it from space and they would have seen it from the Tom satellite. Turned out that NASA had programmed the satellite to disregard abnormal readings, including low readings. So it was in the data, but they had not examined the data. They'd thrown that out as part of their ordinary data cleansing. So I think that the graphic evidence of climate change is far more persuasive and frightening than the ozone hole. The ozone hole was in the middle of nowhere, hardly had any population. People at the time were struggling to say what's the effect of the Antarctic ozone hole, even if it dilutes the ozone across the face of the Earth. But when you accumulate what are the tipping points for climate and you look at those and you realize that frequently, almost too frequently, there'll be news announcements that these things are going badly. The boreal forests, the Amazon, ocean currents, the air currents, the ice melting, the problem of when the tundra melts, it liberates methane and other greenhouse gases. All of these things are bad news. So I do not believe that it's an unfrightening set of data. I think it's extremely alarming. If you look at the literature that's under the Planetary Guardians literature, which has been out in the last few years and actually includes Paul Crutzen as an argument, as an author who's one of the Nobel Prize winners for protecting the ozone, you find that when you divide it up into different risks of sustainability to Earth, that the Montreal Protocol, that a lot of them are in the danger zone, and the Montreal Protocol is the only aspect that entered the danger zone, meaning that it was in risk of immediate peril and then got pulled back out. So it's a sobering literature to say that lots of things, the ocean and the forests and the species and any of the indicators like insects and birds and so forth that are counted aren't looking good for the Earth. One more reason. So this is a slide that we used in 2007 to accelerate the phase out of one of the class of chemicals, HCFCs. You can see here that what it is the left axis is the GWP, the global warming potential weighted carbon, and it shows the CO2 according to the IPCC scenarios. So up into this time, around 2007, you can see that there's the record of CO2 in the atmosphere, and then the red band, it's the top of the red band is the highest growth rate, which is close to what we're having today. It turned out it was closer to the top than the bottom. You can see the lower range, and then you can see the carbon-weighted emissions of ozone-depleting substances starting in 1974. If people had not boycotted aerosol products in the United States and Scandinavia, and you can see that green band at 2 rates of growth equals the carbon equivalent of carbon dioxide emissions around 2010. No scientist in the world believes you could double carbon dioxide and keep Earth alive. So there's no question that if there had not been the warning in 1974, Earth would have ended before now, many years before now. Look at the blue line. That's after the Molina warning. That's the 1987 Montreal Protocol. And you can see the black line, the actual production of the chemicals. That's the phase out. So it's a heroic effort to lower the emissions. And you can see that if it had not been lowered, it would have been in the blue band, which is about a 50% increase or more in carbon dioxide weighted emissions. So the Montreal Protocol twice pulled us back from the tipping points that would have destroyed life on Earth, or at least on land, and once pulled us back from the ozone depletion that would have been horrific health effects and agricultural effects and so forth. So it's a great story of heroic actions just in time, or a little bit too late, and a lot of work paying off for everyone involved. I thought I'd put these up because there's an element of passion that drives these things. And I think people forget in international treaties and national regulation that a lot of what gets done is because people care. So after years of retrospection and fighting to protect the ozone layer, these are the kinds of things they say. So these scientists that were durable against the criticism and helped collect other scientists to support their views, make the case that you cannot just do the research, publish the result, and then hope that something happens. You have to stay involved through the policy process to cultivate action based on the science. Otherwise, there's plenty of warnings, like all the warnings of the planetary boundaries, which are not being heeded, right? That people aren't doing much on endangered species in the oceans and so forth. And then they use this slogan, which is age-old, which I love: if not us, who? If not now, when? This is giving up the idea that you could wait a while to see if your science had an impact, and then you could re-engage later. They're saying, don't do that. Huge mistake. So I thought I'd just briefly touch on these two eras that were very important, 1974 to 1987. So Mario and Sherry have warned of ozone depletion, and then in 87, the Montreal Protocol signed at first by 24 nations in the European Commission, and then grew into a treaty which is now ratified by every country on Earth. It was the first treaty, had universal ratification. Only one other treaty has ever achieved that on any topic. So it's a very popular treaty worldwide. And we'll keep that in mind because elections don't always affect popular treaties. So along the way, atmospheric scientists did better and better global assessments of the risk of ozone depletion. I'll show you a slide in a minute that shows you that time series. But this was very helpful to have global scientists starting with centers of excellence and then slowly adding other institutions, realizing that an assessment is better when it's cross-branded, so that European, Japanese, at the time Soviet Union, and then Russian, lots of organizations are part of the assessment process. So they have a chance to include the differences in the science as measured all across the globe and so forth. And then at the same time, two people, Alan Miller and David Doniger, that are at the Natural Resource Defense Council, who helped Mario Molina and Sherry Rowland popularize their view in 1974 at an American Chemical Society meeting. They stayed with it. So for the longest time, they were behind the US regulation that banned aerosol products finally, and then considered but did not extend the regulation later. When the United States lost interest, they moved to the United Nations Environment Program, where they persuaded the head of that program, Mustafa Tolba, to pick up the issue and carry it forward under the United Nations flag rather than under the United States flag. So it was changing the team when the first team failed. This is very important. It doesn't always mean you should stay with the team that was successful at the start if they don't have the fortitude to continue. So this genius, Mustafa Tolba, who was a botanist, a plant pathologist, head of the Egyptian National Museum, head of the Olympic Committee for Egypt, had a lot of achievements in his past, really wanted to protect the ozone layer. So he took it on himself to put the building blocks together, and wherever he went, on every occasion, he made the case for a treaty to protect the ozone layer. So reaching out, proactive, not waiting for something to happen, getting to know the scientists, getting to know everyone else. And then organized by these countries, Australia, Canada, Finland, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, and the United States. They created something called the Toronto Group that met in closed meetings over a period of about 5 or 10 years, and they were like-minded like-minded parties that came together with the same good ideas, so that when they got to a meeting, they didn't debate among themselves. They already had resolved 90% of the details, and then they would take on board with TOLBA any complaints of other parties and address those as best they could and work their way to success. So this is this is exactly like business. You would never go to a meeting, public meeting, to propose a wind farm. You'd surely try to get as many as the issues out of the way before you got there. You'd have your financing in place. You would have worked with the chambers of commerce. You'd have suppliers on board. I mean, this is not unusual. It's just unusual for government. And then my bosses at EPA, John Hoffman and Steve Seidel, were tenacious. And they strategically debunked a lot of claims of the chemical companies. So for example, the chemical companies at one point said, yes, it's true. If the use of CFC continued after 1974 and the boycott, it would be dangerous, but it will never happen because there are no uses that important for the chemical. Don't worry, it's stalled. And so Steve and John did a study that showed that it had resumed its growth in the markets where it was allowed, the same as it had been, and it had eaten away at the advantage of the aerosol propellant ban. So it's debunking a false claim that obviously the manufacturers of the chemical knew, because they're selling the chemical. So it's pretty hard to say that people selling a chemical don't know that their sales are increasing. And in fact, if you look back on the history, you find out there are new applications proposed every year. That if you're using halon in electronic facilities, pretty soon you're marketing to ships. If you're using it for ships and electronic facilities, pretty soon you're marketing it on aviation applications. This is what salespeople do, of course. So these are these assessments, and you can see it's pretty impressive. It goes back to 1980, and it's periodic after that. The top row is the World Meteorological Organization, and these continue today every 4 years. If you look at the 20 questions and answers that's in the reference materials, this is a document that translates these elaborate scientific studies into something you can understand and then converts them into 20 questions and answers. So it's a good way to communicate to a sincere person, even scientists. And then there's these other things, the trends report, and then the safeguarding the ozone layer. That's a report I co-chaired, which was looking at the relationship between the Montreal Protocol and the Framework Convention and how they treated chemicals. Some of you may know that Kyoto Protocol include hydrofluorocarbons, which were added by the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. So this record is extraordinary. It's brilliantly done. I was talking to Dr. Mazerel last night. They avoided all the pitfalls that are over at the IPCC. They're qualified experts. They have controlled peer review. There's no censorship. They write it and it's published. It's not given to government policymakers to look over in advance. There's no such thing as edits and whatnot, which weaken and humiliates and make it it's delayed publication. Everything that you would want in an assessment is not in the climate assessment. And of course, it's full of qualifications. So it's very difficult, even for an advocate, to read through and find 3 sentences in the row that are decisive. This is not the same as these reports. Well worth study. So my role was interesting. I was hired by US EPA in 1986, a year before the Montreal Protocol. So at the meeting of the parties 10 days ago, I was the last person that was in Montreal in 1987 when it was signed, because everyone else is aged and tired, whereas I'm aged and still working. So what I did is I was the person who elaborated the solutions. Other people are making the case for the science, making the case for the consequences. I was showing that the solutions were not so hard, because the industry was claiming in 1987 that as much as they'd like to control these chemicals, there were no alternatives that were safe to use, and that you'd be trading one problem for the next, and they'd be better off sticking with this, enduring stratospheric ozone depletion and toughing it out. And they predicted years and years before something would happen. So I had to break that, and I broke it first of all at the meeting. I had been working with the United States Air Force, who used a lot of halon in a lot of applications, and they had come to the conclusion that they could cut their emissions by about 90%, because 90% of their use was testing and training, and 10% was against fire. So they said, we can defend putting out the fire, but we're not going to argue over testing and training, because we can do that in another way. We can test with other chemicals, we can train with other chemicals. So it was breaking presumption of the Air Force. So in uniform, this person who Denise and I still work with, Tom Morehouse, presented the Air Force view to go ahead in the 1987 Montreal Protocol and freeze the production of halon. They were going to reduce CFCs by 50%. Everyone agreed to the freeze, and then within 2 or 3 years, they changed it to an earlier phase out because there was an overabundance of halon once people eliminated testing and training and then used it only on applications where it mattered. It's also significant that the environmental NGOs, like the one I work with now, were part of the solution. And they did things environmental organizations don't always do. Greenpeace made an agreement with an East German refrigerator manufacturer and created something they called a green freeze, which used hydrocarbon isopentane for the refrigerant, and proved that it was more energy efficient than CFC-12. It was safe because it was a very small charge, and it had the advantage, an acoustic advantage of being quieter, which is an advantage in many places where the refrigerator is not far separated from where people sleep. So it was a tremendous success. You don't see that a lot of an environmental NGO putting their name on a product and then selling it out into the world. And they promoted refrigerant recovery and recycling and just lots of other things. So they were on board with industry in all the activities industry did that would be useful. As I mentioned, some people say the ozone layer was successful because it was easy, climate's hard. This would be my description of why it was hard. 240 separate sectors, separable uses with different markets and different technologies and so forth. Huge spectrum. And then, of course, tens of thousands of companies, millions of employees, billions of customers. So this is a deep hit. It's not more gentle than energy. Energy is used by everybody also, and there's a lot of companies involved there. But this is pretty thorough, and technically important uses. Medicine, for example, certainly important. Hardly any hydrocarbon use important to medicine. So it's also the case that there were sectors that were dear to the heart of the regulators, including the scientists. So NASA was a user of halon. They were users of CFCs and HCFCs for their wind tunnels to create a more dense fluid within the wind tunnel. And they used some of these gases for trace gases and so forth, laboratory and analytical uses. They're used to develop latent fingerprints in crime scenes. So there's a lot of things that people might normally just rule out with a loophole. They didn't do that they were very sincere about doing these things. So to get to Kigali, I mentioned these hydrofluorocarbons. These are ozone-safe alternatives to the 15% of the ozone-depleting substances that were not replaced by non-fluorocarbon. So 100% of uses, 85% is not in kind, not fluorocarbon, 15% is fluorocarbon. That's the HFCs. The Kigali Amendment gets rid of that 15% in a phase down right now that will turn into a phase out. So the evidence that we produced on that was based on this philosophy I developed about science too important to leave to chance. that you needed policymakers to tell the scientists what they needed, and then the scientists could see if they could do the work to make that case. So this is the second paper published by me and these other scientists, the so-called Wilders papers. And in both papers, I've highlighted in red here that Mac McFarland is a co-author. He is the chief scientist for DuPont. So we made the case sector by sector where HFCs are used about what the growth would be without an amendment. And then we made the case for the alternatives that would be available in each of those HFC uses. So we came to the policymakers with a package that was pretty persuasive, that they could not ignore the HFCs. And here you can see the world avoided with the Kigali Amendment. It's pretty impressive. You can look at the gigatons, you can compare that to what other people are doing. But this is huge. This Kigali Amendment makes a big difference. And it's by species and so forth. So we think we did a pretty good job of this. It was also the case that we had top support of leaders. And I think that this has been a problem for the last at least 4 years and probably longer, is you don't see the Secretary of State making statements like this. And I believe that the passion of these words you see here, you can study them later, are very impressive. That this is someone that you'd listen to, you can imagine the audience. This is a breath of fresh air because the diplomats don't have the status of the US Secretary of State. And so and he was in and out and back again in a week-long meeting, and then of course, the agreement was made finally. It's also the case that Mac McFarland was the communicator to the industry that worked. Scientists sometimes think you can present the same slides to industry you would present to colleagues and it will work. I always argue it's a different audience and it may require a different presenter. So I think a US EPA scientist producing to industry, presenting to industry would be less effective than Mac McFarland presenting, and that he'll receive much more honest feedback than a public figure would ever. So it's a much better place to resolve these. So you need these people like Mac McFarland. I think all of us believe the treaty never would have made it without it. And then the cooling community, refrigeration and air conditioning, heat pumps, were making the case, please control HFCs under the Montreal Protocol if it must be controlled somewhere. That's because of trust and confidence in the Montreal Protocol, and I would argue because they had monkey-wrenched the Framework Convention so badly it would be the last place they'd want to go. That they'd made it so hard to protect the climate as the Framework Convention that they demanded to stay as the Montreal Protocol. So this is incredibly powerful. Without this, 2007 Kyoto Protocol had HFCs in it. Nothing had been done. A decade of neglect. People used to say CO2 sucks all the air out of the room, and there's no capacity for methane and HFCs and so forth. It was an over-focus on CO2. So, and then the Montreal Protocol is outcome-focused, which is good. This is people celebrating. It makes a lot of difference to have a victory with a community of people you like, because then when you come to agreement, you don't storm off in anger, you hang around. And so the meeting ended at 6 a.m. the day after the meeting was supposed to close. People hung around to about noon taking pictures with each other. And then on to the night, of course. Some of us are night people, so there's a lot of stuff the Montreal Protocol can do. I wanted to point out why the climate protection fails, because I think this is a lesson that's important. And one of the things I would say is that the climate activists have been led down rabbit holes by the industry of plausible solutions that just don't work out. Sometimes people will say it's the next solution, and it always will be, year after next, right? So ridiculous burden of proof. If you look at the climate scientists, they want 5 sigma, they want no qualifications, they want global applicability. You know, sometimes people want things like, let's not just protect the climate, let's implement the millennial goals. You know, what can you pile on to protecting the climate that will make it impossible for you to grasp? And then people chase all of this stuff. Carbon taxes, pledges versus controls. They just released yesterday that the CO2 is growing out of control, and the pledges are long left behind and no hope of reaching them in the foreseeable future, right? So that's like a big celebration for people who said, let's go to the pledge right. Let's figure people pledging. And I think from the start it was unlikely to work. The censorship was a bad idea. And then this ruthless torment and discouraging of scientists and corporate people is very tough. So you can imagine if you're a company with a technology that helps protect the climate and you keep running into headwind, that it's not much fun to be in that company. The people who are called sustainability officers or climate officers or whatnot, that this is unnecessary. And under the Montreal Protocol, we put most of that to rest early on and made heroes out of the people that were getting the job done. And then I would argue there are not many partnerships that work. And then this cooperation that Denise mentioned in passing, the US military and other militaries, including USSR, were strong advocates of the Montreal Protocol. NATO itself wrote to the United Nations supporting the phase out, even before they had solutions. So the NATO letter said this is so appalling as a threat to global security, we have got to stop the chemicals. We'll work out the solutions as we go. This is so much more proactive than you see today. If you look at the literature on climate and military, it's very strong from the experts, incredibly strong. Some of the most inspirational you can get. I included the reference to Sherry Goodman's book in the back of these slides on what she calls the threat multiplier, how climate makes every risk to national security worse. It's very persuasive. And she's got lots of testimonial from testimonies from military experts and so forth. So you can look at these food for thought things. We just got a few minutes to go. I think I did pretty well. But in closing, I'd like to say that, repeat what I said at the start, which it definitely happened. There's no doubt that we protected the ozone layer and protected the climate. There's no doubt that it had industry and military cooperation. No doubt it was cost effective. The tools that they used that are a whole basket of things, trade barriers and financing and so forth, all work together. It's a complicated package, but it was pretty successful. Developing countries qualified for what's called the agreed incremental costs of market transition. So if you're one of the what are called Article 5 countries, you can get paid the difference between the obsolete technology and the next technology. It only costs $4 billion so far to get rid of all the ODS. And it saved, when people calculate, trillions of dollars in skin cancer, cataracts, and so forth, and not even these other calculations. And you save the Earth twice. So if you said to an economist, what would it be worth to have the Earth last 10 more years? They would say that is a big number, right? A really big number. And especially if we're the people that want to live in those 10 years, right? And it's especially hardy. So please be optimistic and good luck with your careers. Thank you. Great. Can you come up? So I am kind of deaf, so you may have to translate a question.
Okay, so, yeah.
So one question that I have was, how can the lessons learned from the Montreal Protocol be applied to terrestrial pollutants, such as persistent organic pollutants? And attempts have been made, such as the Stockholm Convention of 2001 on persistent organic pollutants, but it was largely ineffective. So I guess what changes could be made?
How can the lessons be applied to two things? What?
So the question is, how can the lessons from the Montreal Protocol be applied to persistent organic pollutants, terrestrial pollutants, POPs?
Oh, yeah, good question. These are tough questions. These are good questions. Yeah, so for example, one of the reference sections I have is about an interesting case in the Montreal Protocol where ODS, ozone-depleting feedstocks, are used to produce plastics. And when you produce the plastics, in the process you get POPs and TFA and PFAS. So it's a chemical soup to produce any plastic, and you get lots of what I'd call co-benefits. So the way the Montreal Protocol does this is top-down. This is different than other treaties because what it does is it sets a baseline for something like how much feedstock did you use in 2024, and then it can easily, with just a vote of the parties, lower that by 10%. So 15% of plastic in the world is made with these chemicals. Lower it 10%, that gets it started because the market has to sort out what do we not make that we used to make. And then this committee I used to manage, the technology committee, tracks that and makes sure that the alternatives are environmentally superior and in fact calls out the technologies that work to the delight of the companies offering those technologies. Because then people are asking, my industry's complaining, how can I make this plastic product? And then they look in the report and it says this technology from these suppliers, apply for funding. And it's very straightforward. So the top down is a lot easier, I think, than what they do with POPs and these other tragic chemicals is they try to say, let's figure out every little detail and come up with a command and control, which is not very easy to do. They haven't done this for feedstocks yet, and it's irritating to me. It's one of my ambitions for 2025.
So your message is basically take a top-down approach and try and find substitutes and get rid of the chemicals from the start.
And then help the industry. We also go to a lot of trouble, remove barriers, and put in place new regulations that support industry. I think that the current talk about not liking environmental regulations forgets that they're facilitating and that they're a tremendous marketing advantage. If you're trying to sell something and it's endorsed as working by something like the Stratospheric Protection Program, which authorizes every alternative to ODS, that's a big head start because then you can say the United States government says this has efficacy and that's safe to use. So it's a pro-business environmental regulation.
And that's one of the things the Montreal Protocol was very effective at doing, bringing together consortiums to identify substitutes, 85% of which, as you pointed out, are outside the category of these halogenated chemicals entirely, which is something that's really valuable because every time we see halogenated chemicals, they turn out to have all sorts of adverse environmental and health impacts. So moving away from that category of chemicals is hugely effective.
Can I give you one really fun anecdote? The halon people were tenacious in saying halon's this great chemical because it's a magical chemical because you can have halon in a room at a concentration that puts out the fire, but you can still breathe. That's unlike carbon dioxide where it reaches the extinguishing concentration, you're already dead. So the halon is really valuable. And then they said it's clean. So it's safe, it's clean. Perfect for a telecommunication center because then there's no damage to the equipment, put the fire out, turn the machine back on, back in business. Happened they made that presentation in a room where one of my solvent people were there, Cynthia Pruitt, vice president of IBM. And I could tell she was thinking about something because she was writing things down. She went out in the hall, she made a phone call, came back in about 35 seconds, and she said, I'm the vice president of IBM, and we do not use halon anywhere. And so this person foolishly, like a movie, said, how can that be? And she said, because we manufacture our products with aqueous cleaning and we spray them with water. And spraying water on our equipment has no effect on the operation of the equipment. And then she said, but please consider that the equipment itself is not worth much by the time you get a fire because it's evolving so quickly that you'll want to replace the equipment at any opportunity with the next generation. And then she paused and said, and if you'd like, IBM will back up your facilities so there's no interruption of business if you have a fire in your facility, that it would be transparent to the servers because it would switch to the IBM backup servers and you would continue sales and inventory and payroll and whatever else you're doing, safety systems, all of that stuff. So she created in one meeting, she said within a year, about $700 million of business. They created a whole new, but it never occurred to anybody that you would use Halon in electronics, in the electronics side, because they weren't doing it. It was the DuPonts and the Great Lakes Chemicals and people making this great story about cleanage and, you know, keep your business going and stuff like that. So sometimes you get lucky. I call this getting lucky. But it's also the case that by bringing people together, you're very likely to have somebody in the room that knows the solution differently than the people that are the salespeople. And you're never in the room with the salespeople.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back to the question why this climate action is so much more difficult. So you said the industry lures down activists down the rabbit hole. Is this because the industry has learned from their failure during the Montreal Protocol? Or is it because they're just much bigger and powerful? What's the role that maybe, you know, we have the solution for clean energy, but it's of course much a bigger effort to replace them. Is it all together?
Yes, so there's no question that fixing the climate is difficult. So I'm arguing they're both difficult and they both require a lot of finesse and skill, but that I haven't seen as much skill on the climate side as there was on the ozone side. In this case of the that you raise, I always argue you should do the easy first, and that you don't have to take on the worst cases, like a region that has no capacity for wind, has not much solar, and they're using coal. That would be a bad place to start. You could start with other things. And if you look at the HFCs and the N2O and all the other greenhouse gases, methane and so forth, you'd have a easy first, hard last, and you'd take on the steps that were most economic at the start. Denise Meserol was very effective in looking around the industry and saying, who is it that never chose to use CFCs in the first case? That they chose another route because they were getting rid of chlorinated solvents that were toxic and regulated by EPA. They had to choose something. So people like Digital Equipment Corporation, Ken Olson, who was the president, had been using methylene chloride, and it had seeped into his foundation and got into groundwater, and he had a huge cleanup, and he told his staff he would never use a chlorinated product again. And so they developed an aqueous cleaning, and when they presented it at a technical meeting, DuPont shouted them down from the podium, called him a traitor to the industry, and literally went up and turned off the microphone. And this guy, Leo Lampert, was so humiliated that he went back into his shop, and then we rounded him back up and gave him courage. And he was very effective at saying, this is how we do it, this is how it works. He invited people to his companies in Massachusetts, and then people that wanted to change to what he were doing were welcome to do it. He released the patents on all the technology he developed and all the know-how. He offered to install equipment and give people a chance to have his operators clean their products in their factory to their satisfaction and then back off. So it's a divide and conquer, and it's giving a different set of people some control over it. But it's a lot of details, and I swear to God, there's a lot of those details in these books and in these papers and in the other publications I put here, that it's a repeatable strategy over and over again. It relies on trust and networks and perseverance and sometimes brutal combat. So it's not much fun.
Thank you so much. My question is about the IPCC and sort of institutional structure specifically, which you brought up the fact that IPCC is pretty different governments are more involved in the review process and perhaps undermining some of the work that is going on. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so if you look at the scientific assessment panel for the Montreal Protocol, read through the list. These are all world-class scientists. There aren't public relations experts from General Motors. I served on an IPCC committee that had a bunch of auto people on it, and none of them were engineers. And they were writing about technology, and what writing was to criticize it. That if somebody had an idea, they would put a team of people together and come back in with a criticism. If you get the people together, which is what I did, which were already pledged to get rid of ozone-depleting substances, so they're like-minded and they have a coincidence of interest. So it's a committee made entirely of experts that want to accomplish the objective of the Montreal Protocol. Nobody that wants to slow the protocol. A conflict of interest. So instead of saying declare your conflict of interest, this is almost useless. You can tell the conflict just by listening to them in the committee room, right? If you don't have those people in the room, and it's not an open meeting, all the team meetings are closed. There are no observers. All the public sees is the report that pops out at the end. So it's completed and printed or digitally offered, and it's done. And there's, in 35 years, there's only been a dozen corrections and nothing of significance. So it doesn't diminish the effect of the truth of the report to not have these punitive peer reviews. On the peer review I was on, I got something like 250 peer review comments on 2 pages of text, and the IPCC required that I answer each one in a different way, because I would just, the first time through, I just copy my answer because they're categorized, and some of them had been circulated, right, by industry. So their comment was the same words over and over again. So I would just want to put back, and they said, no, you can't do that. You have to separately consider who is the source, what is the context, blah, blah, blah. So it made my life hell for about a week, because it was really irritating. It felt like a waste of time. That's why I say torment, is that it's not constructive to the process. So you can imagine that you can construct a process that makes the genuine experts reluctant to come back because they're not getting the satisfaction they need. And then I was saying to Denise, I mean, what a system where it's so nameless that it doesn't contribute to tenure if you're on one of these committees. This is a crazy system. You're asking people to spend a lot of money and a lot of time and be tormented and hang out with people they don't necessarily like and maybe have their ideas stolen. And then they come back and they say, I'm sorry, we're only acknowledging the first 3 people on this publication that has 500 authors, right? Is that a good incentive? We listed in the people that develop technology, we issued companion publications with more details, and it listed the name and the company and the phone number. So if somebody wanted to ask a question, they could call Boeing about aircraft. And so it caused Boeing to be the heroes of the industry. And it caused the engineer that was the contact person to have the time of his life, because he was the ultimate global expert on some aspect of protecting the ozone layer. So there's so many details. And these awards were terrific. We gave awards at the Kennedy Center. And people flew in from all over the world. People created monuments on their factory grounds, replicating the trophy, because they were very proud of this stuff. It was in the annual reports. It was in the reports to stockholders. It was in the annual meetings. They'd sometimes have someone like me come and give a presentation about what they'd done. And so it was value added. It was something they could really get behind and stay behind, and then reward these people that are, vice president for environment for doing great work. So before you go, I have one last thing. Of course, it would always be the case. There would be an award or there would be a memento of anything that happens. So for Denise, I have a copy of the latest version of the book.
Great. I use the earlier version of this book in my class.
And then better still,
Oh, wow.
It's,
Thank you
it's,
so much for being here.
it makes the coffee taste better.
Thank you.
Thank you.